If you're here for a loud, opinionated breakdown, you've found the right video. Today we're diving into a hot topic that sounds dry but hits home for everyday life: Australia's move to relax fuel standards for the next 2 months to add about 100 million litres of domestic supply each month. Let's unpack what this means, why it matters, and what it says about how countries manage energy security in a time of global tension. 2 quick frames up front. First, this isn't a permanent policy shift. It's a temporary measure designed to shore up supply in a moment when shipments through key routes are at risk. Second, the intent is to protect regional Australia and key industries like farming and fishing, which feel the squeeze of shortages first. Now, what actually changed? For 60 days, higher sulfur fuel that had been restricted will be blended back into the domestic mix instead of being exported. That's a practical lever. It widens the pool of available fuel, boosting total supply by about 100 million litres per month. In practice, that's roughly 2 days' worth of supply in the national picture, but it's targeted where shortages bite hardest: regional and rural Australia. Personally, I think the big takeaway is about the balancing act governments face between purity of standards and real-world security. On one hand, higher sulfur fuel isn't ideal for emissions or engine longevity in some vehicles. On the other hand, if the system risks running dry, even temporarily relaxing rules is a rational, potentially life-saving choice. What makes this really interesting is how quickly policy is adapting to supply chain shocks. It's the kind of pragmatic pivot you don't often see in highbrow energy debates. What does this mean for Ampol and the Brisbane refinery? The company will be allowed to sell domestically what it previously sent abroad to countries with looser standards. The practical effect is more local supply, and in a pinch, faster access to diesel and petrol for regional operators. From my perspective, that's a reminder that refineries aren't just factories. They're choke points that influence affordability and availability across entire regional food and transport networks. But there are caveats that matter. The plan pledges 100 million litres a month to regional Australia, but that's not a magic bullet. Supply is still constrained by broader global dynamics, like the fight over Hormuz and the current instability in Middle East energy markets. If you take a step back and think about it, the real question is not whether we can generate more fuel, but whether we can ensure reliable delivery through pipelines, ports, and trucking, especially when demand surges. Fuel stocks and assurances from the government are comforting on the surface. But the numbers tell a more complex story. Australia's reserve levels sit around 30 days in some categories, which is below the IEA's 90-day benchmark. In other words, even with the extra 100 million litres, we're still playing catch-up to a standard that many other energy security plans aspire to. This raises a deeper question: should national policy aim for a higher buffer during peacetime to absorb shocks, or is it better to rely on flexible spot market adjustments like this temporary relaxation? The IEA's move to release 400 million barrels globally is a signal that the market is nervous. It's also a reminder that no country is truly insulated from a supply shock when crucial maritime routes are at risk. Australia's government frames this as a targeted, practical measure, prioritizing farmers, fishers, and regional communities. That specificity matters because it acknowledges who bears the brunt of shortages and who contributes most critically to food and energy resilience. From a systems perspective, one interesting angle is governance. The National Coordination Mechanism is stepping in to smooth bottlenecks and fill gaps. That's essentially a playbook for crisis management: unify multiple levels of government with industry to move faster. In a world where supply lines are increasingly complex, this kind of orchestration may become a standard tool rather than an exception. What's the broader implication for energy policy? If this trick works, if the extra fuel actually prevents price spikes and keeps regional economies humming, it could push politicians to consider more flexible, staged approaches to fuel standards during emergencies. But there's a risk that relaxing standards too often normalizes a lower baseline, which has long-term emissions and environmental consequences. This is the kind of trade-off that fuels heated public debate. Let's talk about the farmer and fisher's angle. They're on the front lines of fuel scarcity because their operations are time-sensitive. Harvests, deliveries, and daily market movements hinge on diesel and petrol. The promise of prioritizing these users is meaningful, but it also highlights how fragile rural supply chains can be when a single global event disrupts energy flows. The key question people often miss is how quickly these prioritization decisions translate into real-world outcomes for price and access in remote communities. A few quick, pointed takeaways. This is a temporary, targeted measure designed to buy time and prevent shortages in the near term. It shifts some fuel quality standards back toward pre-restriction norms, at least for a couple of months, to unlock more domestic supply. The policy leans on governance mechanisms to coordinate across sectors and balances regional needs with national stability. The broader risk remains. Longer conflicts or sustained disruptions could force deeper policy changes or price effects that ripple through every sector, from trucking to groceries. If you're watching this and you live in a regional area, what matters most isn't the abstract policy jargon. It's, can you fuel up reliably when you need to? Are you seeing prices hold steady or spike? Are local suppliers able to stock diesel for essential services or harvest windows? Those frontline experiences will shape how palatable this temporary relaxation feels in practice. So, what's my final take? The Australian approach here feels like a cautious, many-layered experiment rather than a blunt policy shift. It's about buying time, protecting essential livelihoods, and testing how far flexibility can go without derailing longer-term energy and environmental goals. Will it work? That depends on the next few weeks, how the global situation evolves, how the domestic distribution networks respond, and whether the political narrative around fuel security remains credible to the public. If the Strait of Hormuz remains a flashpoint and global demand stays high, I'd expect this to become a case study in emergency fuel policy, with lessons for other countries watching closely. And if you're someone who cares about climate goals, you'll want to watch how temporary relaxations are wound back and what mitigations are put in place to prevent backsliding on cleaner fuels down the line. Quick closing thought. In a world of geopolitical shocks, the question isn't just how much fuel we have, but how quickly we can mobilize it where it matters most. That balance, between resilience and responsibility, will define energy policy conversations for years to come. If you found this breakdown helpful, drop a comment with your take. Do you think temporary relaxations are a sensible short-term fix, or a glimpse of longer-term policy drift? And for regional viewers, what's your biggest fuel access frustration right now? I'll read and respond to the most thought-provoking questions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next analysis.